If you're riding with me through this wild frontier tale, make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment with your favorite part, and subscribe so you never miss another story from the Old West. Now settle in, because this one begins on a stretch of land where the desert keeps its secrets and danger rides the wind. The sun hung low, pouring molten light across the mesas and painting the earth in tones of copper and blood. Dust trailed behind a lone rider, a man whose shadow seemed longer than the horse he rode. His name was Jack Coulter, though in most towns folks didn't care to ask. They only saw the scar along his jaw, the cold glint in his eyes, and the way his hand hovered near the worn grip of a Colt revolver. He was a drifter by trade, not quite outlaw, not quite saint, but something caught in between. The trail stretched silent ahead, but the silence in the west was rarely a gift. Jack slowed his mount, squinting toward a rocky canyon where the wind carried faint, broken cries. They were not the shouts of men, nor the howl of coyotes. It was higher, thinner, voices desperate, frightened. His horse shifted nervously, hooves scraping stone. Jack leaned forward, and in that moment he knew, turning away would mean leaving the sound of children to die on the wind. He guided the horse closer, staying low behind the stone ridges. Dust rose in clouds where a band of men thundered on horseback, chasing two small figures scrambling across the open ground. The girls were maybe 10, 12 at most, dark-haired, their dresses torn, bare feet cutting on sharp rock. Behind them, 3 riders bellowed curses, half-drunk with cruelty, rifles clattering against their saddles. One fired a shot into the air, laughing when the younger girl stumbled. Jack's jaw tightened. He'd seen men do worse in war, but this was no battlefield, and these weren't soldiers. The girls darted toward a dry creek bed, clinging to each other, but their pursuers closed fast. Jack slid from his horse, crouched against the canyon edge, and eased his rifle into the crook of his shoulder. His finger rested light on the trigger, but his mind ran heavier. The Apaches were proud people. They did not forget debts, but neither did they forgive trespasses. If they found him with these children, would they see a savior or a kidnapper? A white man carrying their daughters away could mean war. Yet if he stood idle, those girls would vanish into the hands of drunkards who thought of them as trophies. Jack spat in the dust, muttered a curse, and drew a bead on the lead rider. The crack of his shot tore the stillness. The outlaw pitched backward, arms flailing as his horse bolted riderless. The others wheeled around, confusion flashing into rage. Jack chambered another round and fired again, this time shattering a rifle stock clean in half. The girls scrambled up the dry bank, their eyes wide, darting toward the stranger crouched above them. He barked low and sharp, down, gesturing with his hand. Somehow they understood, flattening against the dirt as another shot whined past. The canyon came alive with echoes. Horses screamed, hooves hammered stone, bullets clanged against rock. Jack ducked, moved, fired, always shifting, never giving them a steady target. He fought not like a bandit but like a soldier who had learned to make chaos his shield. One outlaw's horse went down in a tumble, pinning its rider beneath a broken leg. Another turned tail, spitting curses, too rattled to stay in the fight. But the last was stubborn. He spurred his mount hard, circling wide, trying to flank. Jack slid back toward his horse, teeth clenched, rifle nearly empty. The outlaw closed fast, revolver raised, grinned sharp with cruelty. At the last second Jack swung his rifle like a club, knocking the man clean from his saddle. Dust rose, the man groaned, and Jack pressed the cold barrel against his temple. "You follow, you die," Jack said, his voice flat as iron. The man's eyes widened, then he spat into the dirt. Jack let him crawl away, knowing shame would do more harm than lead. When the dust settled, the canyon lay quiet again. Jack turned, lowering his rifle, and found the girls staring at him. Their chests heaved, their faces streaked with dirt and fear. One clutched the other's hand so tightly their knuckles blanched. Jack knelt slowly, holstering his gun. He spoke a few broken words of Apache he'd picked up years ago, clumsy, half forgotten. "Safe now. No hurt." They didn't answer, only watched with the silent suspicion of children taught that trust could kill. Jack pulled a canteen from his saddlebag, offering it. The older girl took it, cautiously, then passed it to her sister. They drank, eyes never leaving him. That night, Jack built a small fire in a hollow where the canyon walls broke the wind. The girls huddled close, wrapped in his spare blanket, exhaustion dragging them under. Jack sat apart, back to the flames, eyes scanning the ridges for shadows. The West didn't forgive men who meddled in its cruel games. Somewhere out there, the gang's wounded pride smoldered, and somewhere else, the Apache people would be hunting for the daughters gone missing. Jack fed another stick to the fire, listening to it crackle. He wasn't a man fond of children. He wasn't a man fond of much of anything these days. Yet watching them breathe steady and sleep, he felt the weight of the choice he'd made settle on him like a saddle he might never throw off. The desert around him was too still, too watchful, as though even the stars were waiting for what came next. Tomorrow, he told himself, he'd ride for their village. Tomorrow, he'd try to explain. But tonight, all he could do was sit with his hand near his gun, staring into the dark, and wonder if he'd saved 2 lives, or doomed his own. And that's where our first night with Jack Coulter ends, under a desert sky where every flickering star feels like the eye of fate itself. Tell me down in the comments, would you have made the same choice, or ridden on and left the girls to their luck? And don't forget, hit that like button and subscribe, because this tale is just warming up, and the real trouble's riding in with the dawn. The desert awoke with the first strike of sunlight, a slow burn crawling across the canyon until the world glowed gold and red. Jack Coulter rose stiff from the dirt, rolling his shoulders and scanning the horizon. The 2 Apache girls stirred beneath his blanket, blinking sleep from their eyes. They did not speak, only watched him with guarded silence, as though waiting for proof he meant what little safety he offered. Jack kicked dirt over the fire, saddled his horse, and motioned for them to follow. The land stretched wide and merciless. Crows circled high, shadows slipping across the stones. Jack led the horse on foot to ease its burden, glancing back now and again. The girls trailed close together, thin and stubborn, their small steps dogged with the endurance of their people. Jack's thoughts gnawed him with each mile. The right thing was to return them. The dangerous thing was also to return them. Apache lands were not kind to trespassers, and white men bearing children back could be seen as thieves or spies. Yet there was no other choice, and Jack had never been a man to bend his course once set. By mid-morning, the stillness broke. A flicker of movement at the ridge caught his eye, no animal, no drifting branch. He felt the air tighten, the way a battlefield grows quiet before muskets thunder. He set a hand to his colt and spoke low. "Stay behind me." The girls obeyed without question. Figures emerged from the rock and brush, first 2, then 4, then more, until the canyon mouth bristled with mounted Apache warriors. They encircled silently, faces painted, bows drawn, rifles leveled. Jack knew enough to stand still. Any sudden move could make the ground drink his blood before the horse could rear. A murmur passed among the warriors as the girls broke into a run, throwing themselves into the arms of their people. One let out a cry that was part sob, part fierce relief. The circle eased, but the eyes of the men never softened. They fixed on Jack, reading him like a hunter studies tracks, searching for lies. He raised his hand slightly, showing he carried no weapon in the moment. Then she came. The riders parted, and a woman stepped forward from among them. She did not ride. She walked with the bearing of someone who needed no horse to command respect. Tall, her hair braided with feathers and bone, her face lined with years of wind and war. Her eyes, black and sharp, carried more weight than the rifles still aimed at Jack. The girls clung to her sides, babbling in their tongue, pulling her sleeves, pointing at the stranger who had shielded them. The woman listened, and as she did, her features hardened not with suspicion but with something deeper, older. She drew her daughters close, pressing her forehead against theirs, then straightened to look at Jack. He braced for judgment, for the swing of a blade or the sharp report of a rifle. Instead, she stepped closer. She spoke in Apache first, her voice low and measured. Then, in halting English, she said, "You took them from wolves." Jack inclined his head. Men worse than wolves. A silence stretched between them, heavy as stone. Around her, the warriors shifted uneasily, waiting for her command. She studied Jack as though weighing the measure of his soul, seeing not only the scar on his jaw and the rifle slung on his back but something in the set of his shoulders, the choices carved into him by years of dust and blood. At last she reached into the pouch at her waist. From it she drew a small object, carved from bone and inlaid with turquoise. She stepped forward until only the heat of the sun stood between them. Then she placed the talisman into his calloused hand. Jack looked down. It was cool against his skin, etched with patterns he did not understand, circles and lines that seemed to shift in the light. He tried to hand it back. "I need no reward," he said. Her eyes burned into his, unblinking. "Not reward. Bond." The word struck harder than a bullet. Jack glanced at the warriors, who watched with grave approval. He closed his fist around the talisman, uncertain whether he'd just been honored or ensnared. "I don't follow your meaning," he muttered. "You saved my blood. Now, my blood walks with you." She tapped his chest, above his heart, then drew her daughters close once more. Jack's gut tightened. Was this an oath of kinship, a claim of protection, or something stranger? He thought of the wars he'd ridden through, the treaties broken, the names whispered with fear. He knew the Apaches carried customs as binding as iron chains, customs a man like him could stumble into and never crawl free of. The woman said no more. She turned, lifted her hand, and the warriors melted back into the rocks as if the desert itself had swallowed them. The girls looked once over their shoulders, eyes wide with both gratitude and sorrow, before vanishing with their mother into the wild. Jack stood alone in the canyon, the talisman clenched tight in his palm. His horse stamped nervously, snorting as though it too felt the weight of what had passed. He tied the charm to the leather cord around his neck, not out of belief but because throwing it away felt like tempting fate. The bone pressed cold against his chest. The sun rode higher. Jack swung into the saddle, casting one last look at the empty ridge where moments ago death had circled him. He muttered under his breath, "Strangest reward I ever had." Then he nudged his horse onward, dust rising behind him as the land stretched wide once more. Yet as he rode, he could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes still tracked his every step, that the desert itself had taken note of him. The bond she spoke of lingered like a shadow at his back, a promise or a threat he did not yet understand. By evening, he found himself camped alone again, firelight flickering against stone. He held the talisman in his hand, turning it, tracing the symbols carved into it. He thought of the woman's words, the way the warriors had nodded when she gave it to him. A man might ride the west 1,000 miles and never find family, never find a place to belong. And yet here he was, bound by a single act of mercy to people who had every reason to hate his kind. The fire popped, sparks rising into the night. Jack closed his eyes, but rest did not come easy. For the first time in years, he felt the road ahead was not his alone to choose. Something greater had set its hand on his shoulder, something old as the rocks around him. When dawn came again, he saddled his horse and moved westward, talisman pressing against his chest with every stride. He did not know what it meant. But he knew the West had its own ways of marking a man, and some debts, once accepted, could never be ridden away from. The town of Red Hollow squatted against the horizon like a scar that refused to fade. Its saloons leaned into the street, its windows clouded with dust and smoke, and its people carried the restless tension of a place too close to lawless lands. Jack Coulter rode in at sundown, the talisman pressing against his chest with every sway of the saddle. He had worn it since the Apache woman placed it in his hand, though he told himself it was only out of caution, not faith. Still, the charm felt heavier each day, as though it drew unseen eyes to him. The townsfolk noticed. When Jack stepped into the saloon, the usual low murmur of conversation broke for a moment. A gambler at the bar gave a nervous glance to the bone and turquoise piece that hung against Jack's shirt. An old rancher muttered something about spirit marks and spat into his cup. Even the barkeep's hand faltered on the bottle before he poured. Jack ignored them. He ordered whiskey, drank it in silence, and studied his reflection in the warped mirror behind the counter. a man scarred, weary, with eyes too old for his years. He thought of the Apache mother's words, "You saved my blood. Now, my blood walks with you," and wondered what fate she had tied around his neck. That night, while the town tried to drown itself in drink and dice, a different kind of watch stirred in the shadows. The outlaws he had scattered in the canyon had not been broken, only wounded. 2 of them had tracked him, nursing grudges sharper than their knives. They watched him now from the street, whispering to one another. They saw the talisman too, and their fear mingled with hate. They believed he had the Apache at his back, that he carried protection no bullet could pierce. To kill him would be to spit in the face of that protection, to prove no man was untouchable. Jack left the saloon near midnight, the bottles burned still warm in his throat. The street was quiet, lamplight flickering against the dust. He walked slow, shoulders loose, but his hand rested near his revolver. The sound of footsteps echoed too close, too many, and then the night cracked open. Gunfire exploded. A slug tore into the post beside him, splinters stinging his cheek. Jack spun, dropped to one knee, and fired into the dark. One man cursed, fell, but another rushed him from the flank. The fight was fast, vicious, desperate, more knives than bullets, more fury than skill. Jack drove an elbow into one attacker's ribs, spun his Colt, and sent the man tumbling into the dirt. But more came. The gang had gathered in force, circling him like wolves. Jack's revolver ran dry. He drew his knife, chest heaving, ready to sell his life dear. For a heartbeat he thought this was the end, that his wandering years would be measured out in spilled blood and silence. Then the desert answered. From the darkness beyond the town came the thunder of hooves, the shrill cry of warriors. Apache riders swept in like shadows cut loose from the night. Arrows whistled, rifles cracked, and the outlaws scattered in panic. One after another they fell, their courage broken under the weight of a force they had mocked and underestimated. At their head rode the woman Jack had met in the canyon. Her braid streamed behind her, her rifle steady, her presence commanding the chaos as if she had summoned the earth itself to rise. She dismounted with a fluid grace and stood beside Jack, her gaze sweeping over the bodies in the dirt. "You carry the bond," she said, not as a question but as a statement carved in stone. Jack wiped blood from his mouth, staring at her. "Seems it carries me." The warriors gathered, silent and watchful. The outlaws who survived fled into the night, their shouts fading, leaving only the hiss of the wind through the street. Jack felt his pulse still hammering, the weight of the talisman heavy as iron. He looked at her, at the children peeking from behind her horse, and felt the truth settle. She had not given him a token. She had given him kinship, a shield, and a burden that could not be shrugged off. "What does it mean?" he asked, his voice low. She stepped closer, her eyes locked to his. "It means you are tied to us. You are not alone. You were our bond, and with it comes our defense, and our judgment. Break it, and you answer to us. Keep it, and you walk with more than your own shadow." Jack considered her words. He thought of years spent drifting from one town to another, of the faces that passed and vanished, of the silence of empty trails. A man without ties was a man without weight, but he was also a man without roots. He looked at the girls who had waved to him with grateful eyes, at the warriors who had risked their lives to stand at his side because of a charm around his neck. For the first time in years, the weight felt less like a shackle and more like belonging. He let out a slow breath. "Then I'll carry it." The woman nodded once, solemn as a judge passing sentence. "Then you will not ride alone." The street grew quiet. The fire from the saloon lamps guttered low, smoke curling into the stars. Jack holstered his revolver, feeling the talisman press against his chest, not cold anymore but warm, as if it pulsed with life. He glanced once more at the Apache woman, at the daughters who clung to her hands, and gave the barest nod of respect. She returned it, then turned away, leading her people back into the desert. When dawn broke over Red Hollow, the townsfolk found the bodies of outlaws scattered like refuse, and whispers ran wild about the stranger who walked with spirits. Jack Coulter saddled his horse at first light, the talisman resting against his heart, and rode west. He did not know where the road would lead, but he knew he no longer rode it empty. The West had a way of carving men hollow, of grinding them down until nothing but dust remained. Yet sometimes, in its cruelest hours, it offered something else, a bond, a family, a reason to keep breathing. Jack had not sought it, had not wanted it, but it had found him all the same. As his horse carried him into the wide silence, he touched the talisman and allowed himself a rare smile. For the first time in years, he was not just Jack Coulter, drifter. He was Jack Coulter, a man who carried the blood of another family in his heart. And in the desert's unblinking eye, that made him something far more dangerous than any outlaw could reckon with.